All right, so here we go. Dr. Hall hasn't made it in just yet. I think he's doing doctor stuff, so hopefully he'll be in here pretty soon. But welcome to our webinar. It's titled Technology Spin, Luxury versus Necessity. I'm your host, Brian Largent. My guests today are Dr. David Hall, otolaryngologist and partner with Eastern Oklahoma Ear, Nose, and Throat, Tim Fawcett, Director of Cybersecurity Consulting with Guernsey, and Michelle Fuller, owner and consultant of Focus HR and and that's all I've got. So the question today is what really determines your technology spend? And if you know what determines your technology spend, how do you reduce your expenses? And there's three things that I wanted to cover right off. And the three things that kind of determine your technology spend is how you build it, your business, your operations, how and when you replace it, your technology, your equipment on a regular basis, or if you're waiting till things fail, and how you service and support it. Are you using a third party? Are you running agents? Are you running lots of security solutions in that on those systems? Ultimately, it comes down to risk. Each aspect of technology, such as hardware, software, licensing, configuration, support, and maintenance, must be matched to your organization's risk aversion or tolerance. And you must be intentional in your organizational risk assessment. So that is kind of my little rote start to this. And I've got a couple of questions everyone's going to be able to weigh in on. And the first question that I have is what are we really protecting against? And I think that that's a good question for everyone here of what are the things that we're really worried about that's going to hurt our businesses and from a technology perspective or cyber threats, HR, any of those aspects. So who'd like to start?
Well, you can't shut me up, so I'll go ahead and start if Michelle doesn't mind. I think when it comes down to making decisions about what's important about your business is you have to make the decision or have the conversation with yourself about what is important to your business. What do you need to be able to do what it is you do? And most people have businesses and their job is to provide services and make money. So what are the obstacles? What do you need in order for that to happen? So if you're a medical facility, obviously you need nurses and stuff to be able to connect to their EMR systems, and you need to be able to bill patients and all these things you have to go through. And so what you had to do is decide what's my business impact for different things happening. I think once you decide what you're trying to protect, like what you asked, that's when you can decide what your threats are. But there's other things that cause risk, and that's going to be those regulations, things that maybe aren't necessarily a risk to you, but now they've said, well, if you don't do this, then you're going to get a fine. Well, that makes it a risk all of a sudden because now there's a monetary loss to it. Those kinds of risks as well. And so that we had to consider those when we're making decisions about what we're protecting.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, when you think about what are you trying to protect, it varies depending on what kind of business it is. As Tim alluded, compliance is obviously an important step, and so that becomes the primary driver for a lot of businesses because of compliance regs that they may have to follow. But I think the other things really are, you have to decide if you're protecting the security of your data because you don't want to be the next breach headline, and you've got an obligation or a concern around that, or if you're just protecting the continuity of your business and the availability of your data to be able to do the things like Tim mentioned, invoicing or, respond to clients or whatever, or some combination of both. And, whether you're protecting what gets out or whether you're protecting who comes in, then drives those spend decisions about where your priorities lie.
So when it comes to security, so you really need to have a real serious and intentional analysis of what you want to accomplish, and then how to apply security that allows you to accomplish what you want to accomplish without reducing reducing your ability to get those things done. So one of the things that we run into often as an IT company when we try to apply security policies to our clients is we start to apply the policies and we have to change the way the company operates. because especially when we talk about medical, and when Dr. Hall gets here, hopefully he can be able to chime in on this. We talk about medical, doctors want to do what doctors want to do. Life and death is on the line. They don't want to wait or do something different, and they get into routines. And that's to be expected with doctors, right? You want them to be able to get what they need to get done in a timely manner. But if that means, emailing patient records in an insecure format, then it's an actual major change to a doctor's process to prevent that from happening or happening in a secure manner. And so we play this game constantly with our clients of how do we get the security at a high enough level and the business to operate in a secure enough way that the liability is reduced without having too much cost, right? So one of the analogies I like to use is the Price is Right game show. And they've got that mountain climber when they're trying to match the price and it's going up and he's yodeling all the way up. And maybe right here is where you think the price is, but you're trying to figure out where to get it. Well, we're doing the same thing with technology, right? We're like, okay, we start here. This is the first layer of defense. So it might be, for us, we always say that's employee training. The next layer of defense is maybe it's your firewall and content filtering. The next layer of defense might be antivirus on all your systems. And then it keeps going up. Well, each of those layers has cost. And so the question is, how many of those does the client need to have to protect their business? And that comes into a huge discussion about their risk tolerance. How much time can they afford to be down? How much time can they be without their systems if they don't have all the protections in place? And it's a tough game to play from a technology perspective. So we see the same things you guys do. So how do you guys see risk tolerance determining technology spend? What are your experiences with that as well?
Well, I know that when we talk about risk, people have a hard time. I've done several articles on this. I think human beings in general have a hard time really doing a good job of assessing risk. And if you're not really doing that well, it's going to be even more difficult than to decide what your technology spend should be. There's also a lot of people out there giving you a lot of advice on things. I know that I've had a client recently that they got a hold of a really good sales team, and so they switched over all this new software that's really going to be able to help them out and things. I'm not entirely sure that they've made the risk assessment to determine exactly what the risks are, but there's still a lot of folks out there making judgment calls on you need this software because this is a risk, and so it's really difficult to say how much should I spend. So I think good partners like you would be good because you're not just the only one doing this. You're doing lots of different companies. You see what works at some places and what doesn't work at other places. I mean, the fact of the matter is you can spend the unlimited amount of money. You can spend that mountain climb right over the edge every single time. But I think we're talking about deciding what's luxuries and what's not luxuries. It's going to depend on things. But here's what I think: if you're going to make decisions on things, security works best when people aren't involved. There's a principle of this thing. One of the greatest things in security since the guardhouse has been what we call SSL or the TLS, the encrypted connections on your Wi-Fi. I mean, on your internet connection. So when you go out to a browser, you need a little lock and everything. Everybody knows that lock's important and all that. The reason that's such a great piece of security is you don't have to do anything. You get a lot of bang for your buck on those things. So you mentioned end user training. Well, that's important too. So you all have to decide, what your risk is and how much faith are you putting in your employees to keep things safe. And if you're not, if you can't or you shouldn't rely on your employees, and employees are humans, and you had a choice between this system over here that just takes away people's ability to do bad things, and this system over here that maybe monitors people or helps train people. If push comes to shove and you have to choose one or the other, I always say go for the one that doesn't involve human interaction. the problem with it is we're dealing with humans accessing things. So we really need to identify the situations which we need to make sure that the users know what they need to know. And that's, how are you accessing your EMR? What browsers are they doing that from? What are they should be trying to be looking for that's going to be suspicious?
I think some people feel like they're being pushed now. So technology comes in, especially we deal so much in healthcare. I reference it a lot. These medical practices were forced to get electronic medical record systems, implement those. There was financial incentive to do so, and they kept getting pushed and pushed and pushed into technology. And then to find out you have to secure all this, and there's a lot of cost to securing it, and the threats are growing and becoming more and more dynamic and active. At some point, you look at these companies and they're like, when is our spend going to stop? I mean, the computer is no longer as efficient as it once was because we've had all these restrictions put in place. We're not operating as efficiently as we would like to. If I'm a finance group, well, let's get rid of all the computers. I'm going to give everyone an abacus because maybe it'll be faster. And sometimes I feel like we're getting there, right? So there's a balance between an abacus, a calculator, and a computer. And we're all trying to throw darts at a board while fighting off all of these attack vectors that are constantly changing and evolving. You spoke about software. We are inundated as an IT company. We're constantly hearing, here's the latest threat. Here's a software solution to fight it. And we have to make the decision of, do we take that to our clients and say, hey, you really need to have this, or you have to have this to be our clients? And we've been caught up in that battle because there's some solutions we really think our clients should have. And it's a constant, like death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? Now you need this new solution and this new solution, and then there's overhead and there's management. You're not going to be as efficient now because you have to have this restriction in place. So one of the things you spoke to, Tim, was putting restrictions in place versus monitoring or maybe policies, and not so much a verse, but you can have policies, but actually put restrictions when possible in place to prevent employees and others from being able to do damage internally to your network, because your employees are one of your greatest risk factors, correct? So speak to that, Michelle. From an HR perspective, I mean, you guys work in policies and handbooks. How have you seen that go down in organizations that you work with the conjunction of IT services and the HR group?
So there's kind of two components to that. There's the way it ought to work, ideally, and the way it works really well, and then the way that it often works instead, right? And so often it works where IT, based on their understanding of the policies or their experience at wherever they came from in a different corporation or whatever, kind of builds those nets, if you will. What are the words we want to filter for, and what are we watching for, and what sites do we block, and that sort of thing. In a perfect world, there's more of a partnership with the operation, with HR, and with IT about what really makes sense, because there may be words in your industry that used differently are typical filters that are used to prevent inappropriate access. But now you've suddenly built that in as a filter, and it's actually a trade name or something relative to your industry that you've just hamstrung a lot of your employees who need to be able to search competitive information or do research. So, it's a partnership that should happen not just with HR in terms of your policies and the consequences for violating policies, but also even with operations, just about how does my business run? And if I do this, how's that going to impact the business proactively versus reactively when suddenly nobody can do their job because of what IT put in place over the weekend?
And we've been there on both sides of that. I've worked for corporations where all of a sudden things were cut off. We couldn't go to YouTube, but we had YouTube training videos the corporation had put together that we needed to have done, that kind of stuff. We run into that a lot. So that's an interesting interplay. In my experience, when I was in the corporate world, not as an independent organization, but when I was in the corporate world, I always assumed that HR directed the higher ups in IT departments on what they needed to do with content filtering and the other things. And and I've discussed this now with various people that I know, including you, Michelle, and that was a surprise to me. I always thought that the HR was either involved or should have been involved on it. So I think that is maybe one of the pieces that's missing is just the real collaborative piece between all the different departments in an organization to collaboratively decide what's best. And I think people always think us IT guys have it all figured out, right? And we think we do. So I think we give that persona a lot of the time. So we always, this is what you need to do. And we've read industry magazines and we love technology. So we want to deploy more technology and we want fewer problems. So we deploy lots of technology to reduce problems, but that drives up cost, right? So that collaborative part, like what Tim was saying, it's really about getting your organization together as a whole and deciding what's best, then architecting out the solutions that are going to get you there. So, and I think that's the part that a lot of organizations are missing because they piecemeal it, or they trust the IT guy. I want my clients to trust me. I really do, and I want to be a trustworthy advocate for their organization. But I don't always know all the way their business operates, and they have to educate me and my guys on how they operate to make sure we're not putting things in place that prevent them from operating. At the same time, if they say to me, I want untethered access to do anything that I want to do on my network, but I want you to take responsibility for securing it, just, get a check, write a 1. I'll keep writing zeros until I'm satisfied. It's going to get expensive.
Well, Brian, I can see this happening at all companies. Just because you're the IT group doesn't necessarily mean that you are really aware of what your company does or what access they need. I mean, you have a general idea. And then we have this other problem that you go out and you buy security software that does things, like you buy a software suite that's going to allow you to block websites. And I'm an IT guy. I say, oh, look, all I had to do to block knives about or websites about, let's just say, alcohol and tobacco. Or I'm going to check that because why would anybody need to do that? Well, I can tell you the other day, I was trying to schedule lunch at Kilkenny's. I wasn't sure if they're open because of the COVID, so I tried to go out to their website, and I couldn't do it because it was that. And so a lot of people make the decision. It's like, oh, well, this is security software. It's a security decision. It's software, so it's an IT decision. When we work with clients, whether it's this sort of thing or just overall what their systems are, we work on trying to figure out what the baseline is. What's the minimum amount of security you need? And that's what it is. Whether configurations, what kind of software is allowed, what kind of software is required, what kind of ports are going to be open, who's be able to access what. All those decisions are made up front. At least they're supposed to be. Lots of times they're not. The idea of it is that once you've decided that, what's the minimum standard, and then you start working on the exceptions. So let's just say that HR or whoever it is decides that by default you can't go to hacking websites. That seems reasonable. But let's just say that you have a group that needs to go to those sites that are identified as hacking sites because maybe they're the IT professionals or they need to look up. They have a reason to. It needs to be an easy process to be able to go and say, I need something different than what the standard says. And I'm not saying that should be the standard. I'm just saying you need to decide what the standard is. And as an MSP, you can say, here's my minimum standard. Here's what your minimum standard should be. But what is the process for not following that standard? And we run into that all the time. Oh, we need to have the newest version of this database. Well, your software quits working, right? So you can't go to that database. It doesn't mean you say, oh, well, let's just do it the other way. There needs to be a formal process of saying, what risks are there to doing this? And what can we do to mitigate that risk? Can we restrict who has access to that? Can we do some more work around the network to limit, who can access that? Can we make the password stronger? Can we put a multi-factor? Whatever that is, we have identified the things that we need to look at because they're different than what our standards are. That way, you're not, IT's not being mandated. They're getting the software and they say deploy the software, and they're making the decisions about it. There's standards that management has decided, and then if somebody wants to be different, then there is a process, and there needs to be a process and it needs to be an easy process. And even if that is, you are going to now allow people to access this cloud service provider. In order to do that, because that's not in our standard, so you're going to do that. Cloud service providers say you have to be able to access them using VPN or multi-factor authentication, or you have to restrict it to your IP address. There's all these things in place. If you're not doing that, then you come back and say, we're not doing that because we don't have the option of doing that. What other options can we have to make sure that we're protecting that? Does that mean that everybody has a 24-character password? I mean, what can you put in place? That's where, once you know what you're supposed to do, then you know it's different. And I know we've talked a few times about, as MSP, you had to have minimum standards for things. And then people are coming in and saying, oh, well, I don't want to pay for minimum standards. I don't think I need to do that. But the fact is, somebody needs to accept the risk. You made a decision that because it's easier to manage everybody that way, that this software is important, and it is important. If someone comes back to you and decides that we're not doing that, one of two things is to happen. Either you need to decide that this isn't a client that we're going to support because I don't like the risk and because you have the risk too, or you have to give them a process of saying, here's the risks of not doing this. It opens you up to these vulnerabilities. It opens up to unauthorized access, and here's all the implications of that. And then if they want to make the informed decision that, well, we're not going to do that, we're going to do this instead, then you can work with them on it. But that's a way you can make decisions about software, about controls, without blowing up the budget.
I want to touch on something. It's related to what you're talking about, and it's corporate culture. We've had quite a few customers over the years. We have quite a few customers now, and one of my observations of our customers is the culture of the organization can be a culture of security. We've been into clients that have had the same employees for 20 or 30 years or more. In fact, I think we have one that has had the same employee for 50 or 60 years. And the organizations that are like that have people that have vested interest, they've been with the organization a longer time, we see far fewer issues on their systems. The employees, they learn how to do their job. They know that their job is important, and they don't do anything outside of the scope of their job. And that's the culture. And even these organizations, we've come into some that didn't have a lot of security in place. Maybe they had antivirus, but that was about it. And they didn't have a lot of problems. And they're hard to sell to because you're telling them, well, you really need these things in place because something could happen. Well, we've been in business for 50 years and we've had computers for 20 and we haven't had those problems. So do you want to, especially Michelle, speak to company culture, what you've seen from a standpoint of turnover with employees? How does the company culture impact the issues that you see from an HR perspective?
Gosh, there's probably not enough time on this webinar to address all of that, but certainly in higher turnover organizations where you have people, especially that don't require a lot of training, there may be low skill level or mid skill level, and you just bring people in and quickly put them on your network and give them the tools they need, and you assume, this AP person or AR person or whatever it is, they just need Excel and access to our system. But when those jobs are high turnover or low skill requirements, et cetera, you end up with people in there who aren't really versed in risk. They're new and they don't really have that loyalty or concern for their employer sometimes. And then largely, the people that you're bringing in, especially to those high turnover and lower level roles, a lot of times are people who, they've had a smartphone in their hands since they had a pacifier, and so they think the internet is like this fabulous tool, and they just don't have, I guess, the fear or the intimidation that people who have come up through learning computers and have seen a lot of breach issues or security concerns happen, these people just think the internet's this groovy tool, and they just don't have that same perspective or appreciation. And so, when you talk about, and I'll sound like a broken record, but the collaboration of IT with HR, with operations, with leadership, et cetera, there's also, they need to know why and understand fully what are the risks and why are we doing this. But your employees need to know that too. They don't just need a policy that says thou shalt not. They need to understand, here's what happens if you do. Not just to you as a person and as an employee, but also to us as a business. And, you know, I think there's sometimes failure to explain the why. And I'm a big believer in transparency, and I think that that helps a lot in improving or mitigating your risk with people.
Yeah, and some of it too, I think, becomes, especially with people with high turnover and younger people that haven't been in the corporate world, especially like call centers. In a way, what you're saying is you can eat from any tree in the garden except for this one, right?
Right.
And they're like, oh, I really want to eat from that tree now. They may not have cared.
Right.
So there's a certain amount of that goes on. So one of the things I think that we've touched on loosely is not applying the same standards to every employee globally. Now, from an IT perspective, that's exactly what I want to do because it makes it easier to manage. From my perspective, right? I want everyone to have the same block list, everyone to have the same everything. And the way I see that is a lot of the times I think of that as I'm reducing the attack footprint and I'm reducing your cost some because I'm reducing that attack footprint, right? But at the same time, I think like what we discussed before, you get the different departments together, you decide the policies and procedures for the organization, what groups that are high turnover. So let's say you have a call center. So your high turnover call center is going to have a lot more restrictions on their computers. Maybe you're running a terminal server. There's nothing locally stored. You're monitoring employees for logins, logouts, access to things on the network. Whereas your HR, your business professionals, your high skill labor then has more lenient policies on their systems. And I think that's totally practical. But from my perspective, it's always, you know, we're gonna lock it all down, but the business has to come back and say, here's our practical reason for why we don't want to do that. We understand the ramifications of not doing that. It's a risk we're willing to take. And again, it comes back to risk. And risk is not risk as an organization, right? Risk is an organization, then you get into departments, you get into individuals. And if you're weighing that risk based on departments, individuals in the entire organization, I think you can mitigate some of that risk through policies, training, education, and software and restrictions. So very good stuff.
Well, I like what Michelle said about the why. I mean, I have children, and employees and children aren't all that different sometimes. But
I have to be careful. I sometimes treat them like children.
But sometimes it's a matter of respect to explain why. I can tell you why multi-factor is important.
Yeah.
And you always say, well, it's important for you to do. We want to protect our stuff, but it's important for you as well. And so a lot of that training is, I think, when we look at training, I think it goes down to that thing Michelle was talking about. It's the why. It's not the what. And because people are always told to do these things, they're not always told the why. In fact, I can see that a lot because I'm in meetings frequently with folks. And so like here's an example. I put this website out there. It was just kind of like a billboard. There wasn't any forms on it or anything. And it was just there for, whatever purposes. And I didn't have a certificate on it yet. It was just there, just out there. And of course they're like, there's no lock at the top of that. That's not secure. Well, because they were told, look at for the lock at the top, and there's reasons for the lock, to compress my identity. But I don't have any forms on there. It's not providing me any security. It's providing me identification, because they're not taught the why. They're taught the how, and what to do. So
it's the old the millennials get this knock, and I hate to lump people into a group, but this is the knock that millennials get. There's a brick wall, a millennial walks up to it, he waits for someone to remove it instead of going around it, right? And training can be that way, and I'm not picking on millennials, I'm just using that for an example. but the training can be that way. This is what you look for in a phishing email. Well, now you get a legitimate email from Microsoft asking you to do something, and you delete it, and now your password, you're locked out of your system. So I agree 100% that the training is your employees are only as good as the training that they receive, and the training shouldn't be black and white. It should explain and educate the why more than just the don'ts.
Well, and there's also and Michelle probably has some perspective on this as well. I've been, in the risk and fraud business for a while, and you tend to see that when you see major frauds at organizations, it's the church secretary who's been there for 20 years.
Yeah.
And so I'm pretty skeptical. When you mentioned earlier, like, oh, these employees have been here a long time, we don't have any problems. I think there's some of that. But also what's important, though, is let's talk about ransomware. So you give people access to every possible file because you trust them, but they accidentally open up the wrong email, and then they encrypt the entire network. The fact of the matter is that person didn't need that access, and they just had that access because you trust them. That's not fair to them. It's not, you're not restricting their access because they're not worthy of it. They're just, you're not giving them access to stuff they don't need for their job, and that's least privilege. And being able to do least privilege is difficult because we're talking about time and effort here, especially when you've outsourced your IT. You have to make a decision about your 20 employees, who gets access to what. And sometimes it's just easier to say, okay, well, everybody gets access to everything. And if that's the decision, that's fine, but you really understand the implications of that. What are you storing on those things? Do you have people have access to back-end databases? I know people who have access to QuickBooks, and QuickBooks has a database. Well, QuickBooks can get encrypted if you have access to that. You don't need that access. And so that comes down to it's a control. You're not giving people access to stuff they don't need. And it's not a pejorative thing. It's just, you don't need access to it. And being a controls guy, I've always said, if you're not stopping me from doing something, then that means it's okay.
Yeah.
It's not really. But from a management standpoint, if you're not, explicitly stopping, it's like you can tell somebody to make a 8-character password. If you're not enforcing an 8-character password, that's how long the password is. And you can't, from a control standpoint, come back and say, oh, well, we have a policy that says 8-character passwords, and we don't ever make people change it. We never inspect it. Well, that's not going to hold up. So, but if we can talk about controls for a long time. In fact, I have on my notes over here to talk about high trust for the medical part. And what that comes down to is there's a lot of organizations in the medical side. High Trust is the company that helps you do HIPAA compliance. It's written to be for a major hospital or insurance company, and it's expensive. It's just a walk in the door. You're talking money. So this isn't like a free framework. It's a whole thing.
It's not your downloadable HIPAA regulation form.
Right. And so basically you have people, you have your small organizations, and they need to be HIPAA compliant, but that sometimes means something different than if you have a full high trust, because you're not necessarily going to do that. So you have these big systems who have these frameworks in place. Then you have these small systems who don't. There's not, and I could be wrong on this one, but I get the impression that there's especially in the medical side, there's a lot there for the big ones, for the big organizations, for the controls frameworks, for the IT groups and security groups. But there's just not a lot there for the smaller groups for enforcement, for guidance, for policies. And I think that's kind of a problem. I'm not sure what the answer is, but I do know that working with, as the IT expert in this one, they're going to rely on you guys heavily to make sure that you're meeting those compliance needs, whether it's high trust or whether it's something else. They're just going to assume you're doing it.
The battle we've had over the years, and I'll be very candid, is when we talk about HIPAA to medical practices, they don't want me in the room anymore, because HIPAA is just seen as another thing, another punishment to healthcare providers. They've been squeezed left, right, and center to reduce costs. You had, anyway, I can go into lots of bits and pieces about that, but they've been squeezed. And so if I mention HIPAA, it's like, oh, there's the door. And we've been through that quite a bit. Matter of fact, I tell a couple of stories that I won't name companies, but they never became clients. But I've been on servers that were compromised where I could actively see through a remote desktop session, a hacker launching attacks against other people from their server that had electronic protected health information on it. And when I pointed it out and I showed them all the logs and everything, they were like, well, we don't think HIPAA is that big a deal, and no one we know has been fined yet. To me, it was mind-boggling, but it's a bury your head in the sand. Now, we're not talking to the business owners. We're typically talking to the practice managers when we do this. And the practice managers, in general, I think some of them, I shouldn't say in general, that's a generalization. I think some of the practice managers that we ran into that do that believe that their job is to keep all fear and costs and everything as low as fear away from the owners, cost away from them, because the owners are the technicians, right? They're the doctors. They're the ones doing the work. They're being squeezed so much already. It's just one more thing not to worry about, right? So we've seen that quite a bit. When it comes to protecting practices, there's a few things that we like to talk about. We like to talk about RPO, RTO, reputation, penalties, and theft. So RPO is a recovery point objective, and that is how much data can you afford to lose before you do a recovery. RTO is a recovery time objective, and that is how much time can you be down. So like if your server dies or it's compromised, you have to order a new server. Is it going to take 2 weeks to get it in? Can your practice survive or your business survive for 2 weeks while you get a new server? And then your reputation, and that goes into employees do something they shouldn't do, and your business gets slammed. They post something in social media, or a good example would be an employee working for a medical practice has a famous celebrity come in. The next thing they know, they're putting it on social media that so-and-so came in for some horrible disease, and they're putting it out there to the world. Penalties, then that's like HIPAA compliance regulations. If you're breaking the regulations and you get a compromise, there's cost there. And then theft, your employees steal data, third parties hack and steal data. All those are the things that kind of weigh into, these are the things you should be concerned with, and you should build those, build your compliance and build your compliance in your business continuity plan around avoiding those. But going back to kind of what we said before, it starts with collaboration within your organization, and you need to determine risk, and you can do that at a granular level. Think as a company as a whole, think as a department, and think as the individuals within your organization, and then outline a plan, determine the expenses, and then go back to the beginning, because maybe those expenses aren't reasonable. Because when I talk to clients, the first thing they'll say to me when I talk about how much data can you afford to lose, they'll say 0. I can't have any data gone. I said, okay, it goes back to that, give me a check, write a 1, I'll start filling in zeros. Because to get to there, you need to have replication. There's lots of things that go into making that happen. Totally doable. We can totally do it. But I don't want to start with a quote of $10 million and work down to a quote of $5,000. So we're trying to figure out how to get them where they need to be. And the reason that comes in is because these organizations, especially smaller, under 100 employee companies and organizations, they don't have that. They're not sitting down as a group figuring out what they really need by department from the top down with a very intentional look at their security and what it's going to take to get there. But it's a do while loop. You're going to go through that process and go back to the beginning. If you can't afford it, then we need to figure out how we're going to secure the environment in a cost-effective way. Then you should have a budget and a plan for all that to happen, where it replaces computers every 5 years and servers every 5 years or something like that. That's what we would like to see. And it's not what we see most of the time. We're trying to implement that with a lot of our clients. So, Michelle, you got any input on any of that? I feel like I talked before you got a chance.
No, when you talk about smaller businesses, that's the market that I generally have supported. A lot of my clients are small businesses and not in the medical profession. A lot of them are manufacturers. And so I think going back again to something that one of you said earlier, you've got to have a partner that you trust and provide, because frankly, manufacturing, small business manufacturing owners, they know how to build whatever it is that they build. And they can squeeze production, and they can reduce costs with materials, and they can do all these things to improve their profitability around the product. But they don't necessarily have an appreciation for what kind of risks they even have, because they don't have big financial transactions they're trying to protect. There's no medical records on their system that they're trying to protect. The payroll system has some social security numbers maybe, but that's really the only thing that they think of in terms of high risk. And so I think having a partner that isn't in the business of trying to scare you into things you don't need, but is realistic and fair, and can say, listen, yeah, you don't have exposure to those things, but what if a competitor pulls your CNC programs off your network that are out there because you're sending them to your machine? So I think there's a need for partners to serve those small businesses, and to Tim's point earlier, to focus on those smaller systems, not just the huge, systems that where there's big bucks often, but there's definitely a need for that, and it's education, again, collaboration and education.
To touch on that, so one of the things that we talk to clients about is if you're down for, your server is down, you're rebooting your server twice a day. We had a customer many years ago that had this problem. They're still a client, but they were having to reboot their server 2 or 3 times a day, and there'd be an announcement, everyone needs to get out of the system, we're going to reboot it. They'd reboot it, things would run good for a little bit, and then they'd do the same thing. And so the question became, how much is that costing you? Have you calculated that cost? Because we're talking about IT cost, hard cost, hardware, software, consulting, support, and services. But what is the cost of actually not being productive? And so in that scenario, they were averaging about 30 minutes to an hour of lost time per day. Well, when you're talking about, let's say, 10 doctors and 50 employees that can't work for an hour a day, that's pretty expensive. And that's happening 5 days a week. And that was just the way they did business for years. And they just didn't know better. That was what they thought technology was like. People that'll accept, well, we're going to get some viruses every now and then. No, that's not an acceptable thing. Well, Susie got a virus again, but it's not her fault. No, it's Susie's fault, or it's your system. We need to get to the bottom of it. We need to solve it and keep that from happening. So, that is from a technology spend perspective, one of the most overlooked expenses that we've seen is what does it cost not to be operational? And so companies will get to the point, and I've seen this so many times, where they're just willing to accept a certain amount of downtime because computers are complex. They expect to have a certain number of issues. And a lot of the times that's just not true. Computers should do their jobs. They should function.
Well, maybe to change the subject a little bit, something I was considering is there's certain controls and things out there that people pay for. They're there, like MFA, for instance.
Multi-factor authentication. Yeah.
Especially to your email system now that a lot of people are on Office 365 and things like that. A lot of decisions are being made to not do that. And it opens up a great big hole. There's a lot of fraud and vulnerabilities are through email systems people are putting in. But if they actually gain access to your email system, then they can start sending emails as you, start sending invoices out as you. They can do all kinds of things. And there's not all the controls you have in place to prevent people spoofing. It won't matter at that point because it's actually legitimate access. We have a lot of clients that, or not just clients, just a lot of conversation out there about MFA, which is available on Office 365. It's not an extra cost, it's just a thing. They don't want to turn it on because they're concerned that in order to make it work, you have to have software on your personal phone, and they're afraid that clients are going to go, their employees are going to come to them and say, hey, I need you to pay for my phone.
It's a legit concern.
Maybe it is, and that's what everybody's saying. I do have one client, though, that I'm working with this week, and so I told them about 6 months ago, it's like, you need to turn this thing on. You need to come up with a solution. My thought on this thing is, it's the biggest risk you have. Why don't you get an option? Do you know those participants? Sorry, I got distracted by a note on there. As I do this, so you come up with an option for this. So maybe it's one of the key fobs you carry around. Maybe that, yeah, exactly.
We sell these, and it's to accomplish that same thing, but it is more work, right? It's an inconvenience. They have to have it on them, and there's more.
I think what you find though is you give people the choice between hauling that thing around or putting the software on their phone. They're going to pick the software on their phone. That's what we saw with this client. They were very concerned about it. Turns out it was not an issue.
Yeah. If you have an alternative that's equally as bad or worse.
Make it worse. Make
Exactly.
it worse.
It sounds awful, but it's really not that big a deal. We're talking seconds to add tremendous security.
So, and that is the number one thing you can do right now for your personal accounts and your corporate accounts. Passwords are horrible. I mean, let's face it, passwords are really just best for tree houses, and just leave it at that.
Yeah.
We need to have something else, and the multi-factor is the answer to that. And it's usually not that it's uncompromisable, but it's definitely very, very effective.
It takes your organization out of that low-hanging fruit where you're an easier target, right? Everything we do with security is to be less of a target. It's because you're never going to not be a target, right? There's always going to be a way. I mean, if the CIA can plant USB drives outside a cafe and get Iran to engineers in Iran, nuclear scientists in Iran, to plug those into their system and then hack the centrifuges, I'm pretty sure that anyone can be compromised. But we're trying to put distance between us and compromise, and there's a cost to that. And how we get to that cost that's acceptable is very important. One of the things I was talking to someone the other day, and this is a little off topic, and if we have some questions coming in, so if anyone has questions, type your questions. We're going to address them, but we don't have any questions right now that I know of. So we're going to just keep going until we get some questions. So one of the things that we've discussed a lot is a lot of companies, in my opinion, don't always know how to value their own products, like small businesses. They don't know how to value what they do. So they don't know how to take a percentage of what they're making in revenue and allocate it properly towards securing their environment. So they don't always do the right calculation to know what they can spend and how much they're making. Especially we're talking about companies with less than 50 employees. A lot of those are muscle and feel, right? They know kind of how to run their business in general, but they don't really know what it'll cost them if they lose a server, or if their network goes down, or they have a flood in their office and things happen. And so that's something that small businesses are going to struggle with if they don't have their own books, all their books in their company in order to know what those costs are. And so when I come in and I talk to these companies, it's usually very clear that they don't know what their budget is. They don't have a plan for their budget. And we try to work with them and get them into a budget and a plan so that they can actually start to then discuss in a reasonable, intentional way what it's going to cost, and is it worth it for them to actually secure their environment. And I'm going to give you an example. If we have a customer that has no regulatory requirements at all, they buy their computers at Best Buy, I go in, computers are covered with viruses, and the company says to me, you know what, I can afford to be down for 4 weeks and it won't impact my business. We're probably not the right company for you. Because that's great that you can operate your business that way, but did you really budget and plan for 4 weeks of downtime, or is that just talk? Do you really know what it's going to mean if you can't operate? More often than not, what we find out is they really can't operate that way. They think they can. And then we've got the exact opposite of the spectrum, where companies didn't budget and plan, and they don't know what they're trying to accomplish. And they say to us, we can't have any downtime. And then we go up to that $10 million mark. It's like, okay, we're going to start at 10 million. And we're going to start moving the mountain climber down, trying to figure out where the actual budget is so that we can get you some security in place. And us on the other side, we're looking at it and we're saying, well, if these customers of ours, especially if they're regulatory, get compromised, we've signed a business associate agreement, we're going to go down with them. And I don't want to go down with them. So we have to set a minimum standard of security to put in place. And then there's the things beyond that we really want to mandate, but we can't because we don't have any customers. We mandate some of these more expensive security solutions like a SIM or an EDR and some of the high-end stuff that's coming out now. So it's a balancing act. It's a difficult place to be.
So it looks like Robin DeVito asked a question.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. What is the specific one pieces of the IT spend that you see companies overspend and underspend? I'll make I think you probably actually would be better to answer that, but I can tell you that I see some of the clients I look at. It's going to depend on your risk, but I see a lot of folks come in and they'll buy security software that is very good at protecting certain parts of their network, that aren't high risk. They're not taking the time to well, and we talk about underspending. You buy a security product, plug it in, and then you forget about it. It takes the care and feeding. So if you're going to do something like that, or any software you buy, you need to make sure that it's using it correctly. So if I'm, just say that I have a system that's going to read all my logs, and I'm going to see a risk. Well, you can spend a lot of money on those systems. You spend a little bit of money on those systems. What you can see though is if you have an underspend on the maintenance, and then you probably overspent on the software. And what I mean by that is to say that I buy maybe a $10,000 a year monitoring software, but I haven't gone through to identify where my risky assets are, and I haven't gone through to collect logs. Or I might even go in there and I say, okay, send me all your logs, send me all the logs from your firewalls, send me all the logs from your switches, but then you don't go through and create any kind of alerts based on those types of events. Very specific events should cause certain types of alerts. So you either need to spend more on your software that's going to, use your artificial intelligence or whatever to help you figure those things out. Or if you underspend on your software, then you need to spend more on making sure that it's set up correctly. And that's not just security software. I'm just a security guy, so that's what I spend more time in. But I would imagine you see that in a lot of things. People will go and they'll buy endpoint software that has the ability to, do, a bunch of functionality that either you don't need or you're not using. So you see a lot of overcost there.
The thing that we see, and we've seen what you're talking about as well, but the thing we see the most, and I'm trying to figure out how to word this because I don't want it to be a shameless plug for us, but it's going to kind of sound that way. So bear with me. So what we see is it's not usually spending too much on technology. It's companies that use an outsourced company that's not providing them the level of service commensurate with what they're paying. So for instance, if you're spending $10,000 a month on all the IT support and services for your organization, but yet you're still fighting viruses and you've got servers being rebooted every day, and you're let's say you're a 70 or 80 person company, then the problem isn't that you are spending too much on individual products. It's that the organization that's servicing your business is not spending enough of their revenue, their gross margin, on making sure they're providing a high enough value. So that value needs to be high for what you're spending. So that's the game, right? In the world of marketing, they have an axiom I always like to use that is there's three things. It's high quality, fast service, and low price. And you can never have all three. You can only ever have two of the three. So if your company is a high price and fast, then they're going to be low quality, right? I mean, I'm sorry, I'm getting some of these mixed up, but you can have two of the three. And the point being, some companies claim to be all things to all people. They charge a very high price. They don't deliver on the service, and you're having issues. So what we want to do is we want to be delivering on the high quality, although we're not going to tell you we're the cheapest, because the cheapest is never going to be high quality, or they're not going to be fast, right? So we want to be high quality and fast. Now we don't want.
There's some low quality out there. I can promise you that. I've seen that. There is definitely low quality out there.
Well, and we've replaced a lot of companies over the years that have been low quality. We've occasionally replaced a company that did a good job, and the customer thought that we would be less expensive, and that's why they went with us. And we would go in, and the company didn't have their value proposition properly aligned. Even though they were providing good service, they were too expensive for what the service they were providing. So it's all over the board. But the organizations, typically what we see, they're overspending on their monthly service agreements, and they're not getting the value proposition within that. Do we have any more questions? We're getting we got about 5 minutes left. Anyone else? Do we have any more questions? I need to figure out where the question box is. Oh, here we go.
There's not any.
Okay, so we don't have any more questions. Is there any topics before we get to the end of this that you guys want to talk about or add in?
Well, to continue the conversation you were just talking about, and I see this sometimes with MSPs, especially the really big ones, and we're always going to run into this in this industry, is that there's always sales teams, and there's one MSPs in particular that they, once they're in there, they're always trying to sell you the next thing and the next, and that's like, I guess, exhausting. It's like, oh, we have this other group, they do this, and we're the best in the world, da, 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 da. And salespeople are really good at that. So if you're going to take anything away from this, find a trusted advisor, and while everybody's trying to sell you something, I mean, I'm a consultant, so I do understand the irony of me telling you not to trust people when they're trying to sell you something. But listen to what they have to say. Understand, do they have your best interest? Are they trying to sell you something because they have a quota, or are they trying to sell you something because it is what you need for your business? And now, there's lots of good products out there, but there's lots of different ways to accomplish things. So I'm just saying, buyer beware. If you can find somebody you trust, trust them. And also keep in mind the salespeople have that job because they're very good at getting that trust. So, but pay attention to what they're asking or what they're promising you, and make sure they're delivering that. And be careful of over-promising. I always say, what's the difference between a software salesman and a used car salesman? Is the used car salesman knows he's lying to you. Software is like everything else. Make sure that when something sounds too good to be true, maybe it is. If you have software that's supposed to do something, kind of think about what those extra costs are. If you're going to do that, is that something that you have the capacity to do internally? And if not, if you have an outsourced provider, do they have the capacity to do it correctly? And that means they're going to spend time really getting to understand your business. And there's advantages to working with people in your industry group. But that's not always the case. It's, get somebody who has experience with different software and different risk things. But my guess is, if you're on this call, you probably have somebody you trust. If you run into other folks that maybe don't have that experience, any of us here on this podcast are be more than happy to give you good free advice.
So my take on that, and I'm going to be really short, and then I'll pass it off to Michelle. My take on that is our organization has been really guilty of not reaching out to our customers enough. And that's something we're working on improving and going to them, and not to sell them products necessarily, but to have those regular meetings so that whole collaboration, determining your risk is actually the customer understands better, that they're working that out. We're a part of that equation, so that 6 months, a year from now, if they're not having any problems, they're not coming back to me going, we don't have any problems. I don't know why we need you anymore. And then, believe it or not, that happens to us quite a bit. As we go in, we clean up networks, we take good care of our clients, but we don't. I personally, as the owner of the organization, I don't like to interrupt people's day. We're doing our job, we're taking care of them. I don't really want to interject myself. And it's because I'm not a natural born salesperson. I'm a natural born technician. And I like to take care of people and their businesses. So we're guilty of actually not going out enough, because there are new products, things that we're going to start putting in front of our customers that we do believe in. But it is against my personality to do that. So we're going to have to work on that. So Michelle, go ahead.
Well, I would just say, kind of similar to where you just said, a partner that actually does stay in touch with you to know, hey, do you have thoughts about software conversion on the horizon? What are you struggling with? Are you, is what's taking a lot of time? Who's trying to sell you what to make your business run more efficiently, right? Because there's so many software as a service companies out there right now. And I think the tendency for the non-IT professional, at least for me and a lot of my clients, is you assume that those software as service companies have appropriate security protocols and protections in place, and that's part of what you're paying for from them. And maybe that's true, but maybe it's not. And once you make a decision and sign a contract and do an implementation, it's a little alarming sometimes to find that now you need all this other additional bolt-on security stuff to maintain the security to your network that you thought you were getting all along. And so I would just say, you know, if your tech company isn't reaching out to you, but you've got somebody that you're considering and you're evaluating quotes for, get your software company involved from the jump, or your service provider, so that they can say, yeah, I think this would be great, but you also need to factor in extra cost for this, and this, you know, that you're going to need if you go that route. So.
Well, and I think for companies that have highly regulatory requirements, I think bringing in a cybersecurity specialist is very beneficial. And then I always say this: who watches the watchman? Even if you have an HR person, even if you have internal IT, it's always good to bring in a third party to analyze what you're doing. So with what you do, Michelle, I think having organizations bring you in, you touch tons of organizations, having organizations bring you in to look at what they're doing with fresh eyes and a different way to look at it. And same with you, Tim. I think that's tremendous value for organizations of all sizes. And even me, we've had customers that have been with us for years that'll bring in a secondary IT company, and they'll look at what we're doing and they'll go, well, you know, we can do it maybe cheaper, but they're doing a good job. You know, we've never had someone come in and give us this huge list of things that we're not doing well. So, and now that I've implied that we're the most expensive, I probably need to sign off on that note. We're not the most expensive, but we try to do a good job, and we have to charge a fair price. So
I can also tell you that I think that, you know, people have said for a long time, you know, there's companies that aren't regulated, and so they don't necessarily have a security mandate. I think that's beginning to change. I think, and this is, you know, if you're not, it's one of those things that you either know about or you don't know about. But if anybody that does government or DoD contracts are going to have to start doing this maturity model compliance. So they're actually going to have to be audited to a certain maturity level of what they're calling the CMMC, which is the cybersecurity maturity model something. I should memorize that. I'm talking about it. But one of the interesting things about it is this is not the DoD coming and doing these audits. These are independent providers that are trained. And so, you know, with audit methodology and things like that. So there's going to be a huge group of people. So this is going to be not just government contractors, but government subcontractors. So if you are working for a company that is working on a government contract, you might be required to meet one of these levels of security. And there's a basic level, there's number one, which all companies should be doing anyway. But what's different about this standard is that it's independent and it is a actual certification that you can get. And it's all about your entire overall security framework or security program. So I think that this organization has the mandate, but it's not just going to be the DoD. I think it's going to be bigger than that. So you might be in a situation where you might have a customer that says, hey, I need you to prove that you do things, you're protecting my data in a secure way. This is a way you can do that. Go get this audit done, this independent audit. And in order to do that, now you're talking about everyday companies that do business with other companies are going to have to not just start doing things securely, they're going to start doing things securely in a way they can prove they're doing it securely, which means collecting evidence of things and viewing things and creating all these processes. I think there's going to be a lot more companies who weren't having to do this before. They're going to have to start doing these things. I think something like ArcLight is good because internal controls and security, you know, a good 80% of those are the things you do from day to day. Those things that IT does, and that's going to be how do you get your systems patched? How do you, set up new accounts? How do you terminate user accounts? Those are all things you're paying ArcLight to do. How are they doing in such a way that they can do it? I mean, they're doing it in a way that's auditable. And so when you have to come in and you have to then go and say to an assessor, how are you doing all these things? You're going to say, ArcLight does that for me. And ArcLight comes and says, here's what we do. And here's the evidence that we did all these things for you. And so I think as that becomes more the norm for anybody doing business with third parties, it's going to become a more affordable thing from the audit standpoint, from the assessment standpoint, but I think from actually, putting those controls in place and collecting that evidence, that's going to be one of those things that more and more companies are going to start thinking about going forward. That's coming fast. So.
Sounds good. All right, that's all we have for today. I'd like to take a moment to thank Timothy Fawcett with Guernsey for coming out, Michelle Fuller with Focus HR, and Dr. Hall regrettably wasn't able to make it today. We'll catch him in another video or podcast in the near future. But if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to me directly. We'll be sending an email out to all the attendees with contact information for all the different panelists, and we'd love to hear from you guys. All right, thanks everyone. See ya.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.